Hello and welcome to the introduction to the global systems part of this unit. So the overall specification topics, then a quick reminder, start off with globalization, which we've completed, then move on to global systems, and then it goes on to international trade and access to markets, global governance, the global commons, Antarctica as a global common, and then finally the globalization critique. As I've said to you before, these topics sort of interweave and interlink between each other. So although we've only done the first bit, globalization, we've touched on international trade and markets, and we've done a little bit on global governance already, and the critique of globalization. So we're sort of covering little threads all the time and adding to our overall understanding of globalization and global systems. So in the specification then, for the global system section, it says the first part then, form and nature of economic, political, social and environmental interdependence in the contemporary world. Issues, so that's the current world. Issues associated with interdependence. Unequal flows of people, money, ideas and technology within global systems can sometimes act to promote stability, growth and development, but it can also cause inequalities, conflicts and injustices for people and places. And lastly, unequal power relations enable some states to drive global systems to their own advantage and to directly influence geopolitical events, while others are only able to respond or resist in a more constrained way. So that's the specification, and obviously we're going to interrogate that over the next series of lessons, and sort of gain a greater understanding of exactly what they're talking about within that spec. So a key word within there is interdependence. I think we've covered this a little bit before. And globalization leads to a much greater level of interdependence in the world. That's kind of the point, isn't it? So as a result of this, because we are all reliant on each other, global systems are needed to ensure that the whole system doesn't collapse. So when one thing goes wrong or something changes, the system needs to keep flowing and keep working. And because we're all dependent on each other, we all have a role to play in ensuring that happens. So we need a system of organization and structures to be able to ensure that that is the case. So yeah, in order for the world to grow and to prosper, it needs to ensure that all the different parts of the global system are stable and secure. And that will then allow for economic growth and development and all of those other things. So these are the key aspects of interdependence: economics, social issues and politics, and they are seen as the sort of key building blocks of the globalized world. So the financial and trading systems around the world, they need to work together in order for us to have a globalized world. We need to have things like healthcare and education need to be linked together across the world in order for it to function effectively, sort of together. Again, if we could sort of stick with that healthcare idea, if you train a doctor in one country, are they then able to work in another one? That's all sort of part of that idea, isn't it, of making a global world. And finally, then politics. The politicians need to be able to work together and communicate effectively together. So we need to have sort of systems that allow that to happen in order to sort of create a globalized world where everybody is sort of following, or not necessarily following exactly the same rules, but following very similar rules, and are able to communicate and work together, so that we don't have lots of great diversity in rules, that would make things not function as well as a global society, a global system, I suppose. So finally, then on this, we've just got this sort of concept, this idea that does, and many people feel this, that globalization is really a capitalist idea, comes from capitalism or encourages capitalism. It's arguable, but hopefully you can sort of see how this might be the case. So modern globalization is very closely linked to the idea of capitalism. It's something that we've seen, that capitalist countries, those that promote wealth generation and becoming rich as the ideal, are the ones that have globalized most rapidly and to the large extent. And those countries that were less capitalist or had less of that idea, as globalization has come into play, they've kind of become more capitalist, and followed that sort of pattern. So we certainly can see that with China and the way that China has changed over the past sort of 20, 30, 40 years. It's certainly become more sort of capitalist in its way of thinking and way of running, as it's become more global, as it's opened up to the world. So one of the things is the freedom to trade, move, and the freedom to become rich has kind of promoted that idea of globalization. It needs to involve trade across different countries. It needs to involve people moving across different countries. And the reason people are going to trade and the reason people are going to move, those key aspects of globalization, are about becoming rich. You don't sell lots of things to lots of different countries for any other reason other than to become rich. And the majority of people, apart from maybe to escape war and persecution and so on, but the majority of people who move are doing so because they're facing poverty and they want to become richer. That's the normal reason for people moving within countries and also between countries. By its very nature, capitalism accepts inequality. It is about inequality. It's about having the rich that we all aspire to. It's about having different rungs of society, which are divided by, or supposedly divided by effort, so that people who work the hardest have the most, and the people who work the least have the least. That's the principle of the idea, that everybody can achieve if they work hard. And globalization, if we think about it, sort of functions through inequality, in that you've got some countries doing certain jobs or certain roles that are less well paid, and that allows other countries to become richer. So you're creating a sort of whole world inequality, where you've got the rich world and the poor world, and the poor world is working for the rich world. And that is a sort of capitalist idea almost. If we go to the opposite idea, or the different large political system of communism, this is one that seeks equality. That's what you're looking for, is equality. And as a result of this, the sort of the principles and the way globalization has sort of begun, it struggles to work with globalization. If we think of the example of China, as China has become more globalized, more aspects of capitalism have come in, about wealth generation and individual wealth being more important than the community, which is obviously the key idea of communism. Just the word communism itself, remember, is about community. So it's very often sort of based in a sort of, although it does grow, but it's sort of based in an idea of everybody working for the common good. And that can stretch to the whole country, and it could stretch to the whole world. So it would be possible to be globalized. It just hasn't happened that way, really. We've been much more about growth for wealth generation, growth to encourage trade and creating jobs. They're the real drivers of globalization, and that's not really aligned to the communist ideal. Another thing just about that then is that communism has been accompanied by isolation, about people not being allowed to leave their countries. If we think North Korea, people from North Korea are not allowed to leave, locked into that country, and that used to be very similar in China, that people weren't just allowed to travel, didn't have the freedom to travel, and as a result of that, again, obviously, that goes against globalization. It's kind of just a core principle. If you can't travel, then you're going to be less globalized. So, as a result of what was sort of suggested here, globalization could perhaps be seen as a way of spreading capitalism and capitalist ideas. So, because we're becoming global, it's encouraging more and more places to take on that idea of wealth generation, about trying to be rich, has sort of spread. So, it's an idea that perhaps has spread alongside or as a result of globalization. And finally, then, socialism is perhaps a balance here. And socialism is sort of a slightly more, is it in the middle, perhaps we could see it as. And so it perhaps could bring the extremes of capitalism down a little bit, because socialism is about fairness and is about equality, but it's not as extreme as the idea of communism and sort of total equality. But socialism is about looking after those people who are less fortunate. Is about although you may have wealth and less wealth, you try and balance that a little bit, through support and through taxation or sort of benefit system kind of thing. That's the idea of socialism. So perhaps there's a balance in the middle there. So a little bit of some politics linked to globalization there, and something for you to just have a little think about. Okay.